Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making it. I'm thrilled to have Sheila Jambekar here today. She is the VP and Deputy General Counsel of Privacy and Product at Twilio. A little bit about her background. She joined Twilio back in 2015 and built out the privacy program at Twilio, a US-based but global communications platform as a service, including guiding it through the downfall of Safe Harbor back in 2015, and then up through GDPR, obtaining binding corporate rules, and now onwards in a post-Privacy Shield world. By building a team focused on doing privacy right, not just checking the boxes, she has helped build trusted data stewardship into the culture at Twilio. And I am so excited to have her here. She is very knowledgeable and very excited that she could share her wisdom with us all today.
Thank you,
So
Patricia.
welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Okay. So there is going to be a Q&A afterwards. This is a 25-minute session with a 5-minute Q&A. So please type in your questions either in the question section or in the chat. And let's move on to the next question.
All right.
The very first one. Sheila, how have you dealt with GDPR compliance internally at Twilio?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So Twilio was it's a pretty small company relatively, but growing really fast when GDPR came along. And so we were in the throes of building a privacy program out. So in some ways, it was a catalyst to hurry it along in terms of getting our privacy program put together, and also created a lot of burden because all of a sudden we had to move really fast and go from having a very nascent program to having a strong one that met GDPR standards in a relatively short period of time. So the way that we approached GDPR compliance internally was really to try to build it right from the get-go. I worked really closely, kind of arm in arm with our architects, our engineering architects, to take these broad GDPR principles and convert them into, okay, what does it actually mean in terms of engineering work? So that teams can then start to think, how do I apply these engineering concepts and then cut tickets in Jira and actually start executing and implementing these controls? Because you can imagine something like data minimization. Well, what does that actually mean when it comes to engineering that into your products and services? And so that close partnership with our architects was key. And so even today, that's continues how we operate is we're thinking about new controls or different controls. We think about, okay, what does that actually mean operationally? How does that actually get implemented by the engineers? And we need to work with folks who have that technical background who can help serve as that bridge. So we have sort of this bridge between ourselves and the architects to then bake that into how we operate. So that is how we dealt with it. And now today, that's part of our engineering standards, to make sure that we keep those controls, that they stay in place. And we try to leverage the tools that our engineer and architecture teams already have in place, so that it's not layering on this sort of new thing on top, but it's actually infused into how we build from the ground up. So it's a journey. Like, I'm sure we've always got room for improvement, and to improve upon those processes. But that's the concept that we've been using. And at the same time we did the GDPR compliance, we worked on our binding corporate rules, which worked really nicely together. And we're able to sort of layer on that policy piece at the same time as working with the engineers. So that has been our approach.
That's fascinating, Sheila. I think that a lot of organizations have trouble being able to bridge that gap between the privacy team and the engineering team. Are there any tips that you have to making that a smooth process?
Well, I think that to me, I think the important thing is, on the lawyer side or the legal side or the privacy professional side, finding people who are humble and curious. If you can get people who really are interested in trying to understand and capable of understanding how engineering systems and the services work, that's going to make that much easier. And then, you've got to find those champions within the engineering or architecture team who are interested in doing the right thing and the importance of privacy. Those can be your best advocates, and also to be interested in from their standpoint of how do you implement these things. So I think if you have this sort of, if you have the lawyers who are like, well, I don't need to understand how engineering works, or I don't need to understand the details of how the data flows or why this is hard, just make it happen, then that's, your engineers and your product people are going to push back and be frustrated because we're speaking different languages. But vice versa, if you've got if you're trying to work with engineers or product team members who don't buy in to the value of what you're trying to ask them to do, then that's not going to work either. So I would say there's a bit of internal marketing as well that I think goes into building a privacy program, and getting everybody on board is like really, finding those champions, but also selling to the organization why it's important. And so that there is an intrinsic interest beyond just the legal team or the privacy team in getting it done. But I think perhaps first and foremost, because the engineers and the product folks, they are the people who are bringing in the money, right? Like they are building the thing that makes the company money. And the trick as coming in from a privacy or legal or any kind of compliancy perspective is, how do you not feel like a burden? How do you find ways that you can help them, rather than just you being one more thing that potentially stands in the way of them, launching their product and selling it and making money? Not to say that there aren't going to be moments like that, right? Inevitably, you run into that. But even in those moments, you want to be able to explain to the organization why it's important to maybe stop and tweak something or change how you do it. And not just from a, well, because I say so, because I'm the lawyer. That's not going to get you very far. That's not going to be very compelling.
Mm-hmm. I love that answer. That's great. And I think that the fact that you spend so much time focusing on the engineering piece, understanding how the tech works, is a really great point. It makes such a difference, and is also one of the reasons why I really enjoy speaking with you. Are there any regulations coming up that don't fit in nicely with the GDPR that you're working towards complying with?
Goodness. Well, the upside being that most privacy principles are based, most privacy laws are based at least to some extent on the OECD principles, which are international. But there's always unique ones out there. The ones that we struggle with are, or that we're working towards and thinking about how we would tackle, are privacy laws that have a data localization requirement. The Schrems 2 case that came out middle of last year, which was based on GDPR and then created kind of stricter rules around data being moved out of the EU, started to put the GDPR almost into the same realm as some of these laws that make things more difficult, which is keeping the data in country. So India has some laws that it's looking at. You're starting to see that pop up in different pockets around the world where there is a need to keep data in the country. The other ones that are interesting and create sort of a new angle that GDPR didn't bring along are the data sale type laws that we're seeing crop up, like the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, laws like that have this element of it's very specific to data sale, create some interesting angles that change the landscape, because now instead of just having to think, am I a controller or a processor, you're now thinking, am I a controller, and is the thing that I'm doing constitutes a data sale, and in some ways makes it more difficult to comply and layers on additional obligations. So those are the ones that I'm keeping an eye on. Some of these like smaller ones, the Illinois Biometric, these are existing ones, but Illinois Biometric Act, the CCPA, what other laws are going to crop up like that? And then the other one that's coming along, there is some chatter right now in the EU around AI regulation. And so that is another one that we're keeping a close eye on. It's kind of adjacent to GDPR, that they're starting to talk about, do we want to put in new regulations related to responsible AI and ML. And that is an interesting one because that goes beyond some of the principles of privacy of making sure that people can control their data, or being concerned about the sort of the classic privacy issues of like, where is the training data being used and how it's being used, but really moving beyond into things like making sure that the AI can't be hacked, or is it dangerous AI, and unintended consequences, things that really there isn't as much history on how to solve those problems from an engineering standpoint. So keeping a close eye on that stuff so that we don't lose sight of how that could impact the business as it grows.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And what are some common mistakes that you see companies making when with the data that they are handling?
Oh gosh, I think that but perhaps the like one of the more common mistakes is that you run into is just misunderstanding. For example, companies thinking, okay, so we just removed the names from this database, and so it's all anonymized and it's totally fine and we can use it for whatever. And not realizing that that doesn't actually constitute, for example, true anonymization under privacy laws. Some of that hubris of like, oh, we think we just removed the last 4 digits of the credit cards and the names, but they haven't actually truly anonymized the data. And then, someone figures out that you can re-identify it and do some horrible thing with it. So I think some of the common mistakes is just recognizing what it means to anonymize data, what truly constitutes personal data. It's not just if it directly identifies me, Sheila Jambekar. It can be a combination of factors of a middle-aged woman in the Bay Area who works in tech and she's a lawyer. You start to put those pieces together and in a data set, and you can still find me. You can still figure out that that's me. So I think that's a common mistake that or misconception I run into from businesses, is thinking that like the only thing you need to do is to remove the identifiers. The other one that I run into similarly is the assumption that that if you just hash it, we just hash the data and then it's all anonymized and it's fine, and you can go off and do whatever you want with it. Well, also not true. I mean, it may not be directly identifying, but it may still be pseudo anonymized, and that doesn't count as fully anonymized, and they're still restricted on what you're allowed to do with it. And if you can reverse the hash, or if I can still kind of reverse engineer my way back to the data, you still are, you're still handling personal data, and you have to treat it that way. So I think some of that nuance that can be really tricky, frankly. And there isn't sort of this is anonymized enough, and it can be frustrating for teams. They're like, well, what do I have to do? And you're balancing between trying to be able to use a data set in a lawful way that is anonymized against stripping so much information out of the data that is no longer useful. So that's one that we struggle with, and I think a lot of companies struggle with, and I've seen mistakes being made around, is the sort of assumption about what constitutes personal data and what turns personal data into not being personal data anymore.
Mhm.
That one being one of them. There's also assumptions that, email addresses aren't personal data, for example, or IP addresses aren't personal data. Well, yeah, actually they are, they can be. And so really realizing like the full scope of what could constitute personal data is another common mistake I see. And then I think just lastly, it's just, you see a lot of carelessness. It's hard to get all of the tools and controls in place in a way at a company that's growing, or really any company, to um, to make sure that it's easy for people to do their jobs and not accidentally mishandle data. And so as companies evolve and change and grow, you just run into um, the silly mistakes, the casual things. Oh, I put this data into a spreadsheet and emailed it, or oh, oops, I accidentally emailed it to people outside the company. Things that are unintentional, and yet because we have so much data at many of these companies and people have access to it, in order to do their jobs legitimately, it just every person that has that access can become a vector
Mhm.
for risk. And that's a lot of people you're trying to get, where privacy is not or security is not their first job or their full-time job. Um, that it's tricky to kind of get everybody aligned, and sometimes there just aren't good tools that enable people to both get their jobs done and also um, prevent bad things from happening accidentally, right? Like, I just need to put it in a spreadsheet so that I can get it out. Oh, shoot, I emailed it to the wrong person. I emailed it to someone external instead of the internal Patricia at the company. And now, there you go. You've got yourself a breach. So unfortunately um, that happens. And it's a hard one to find solutions to mitigate against.
Mhm. Well, I guess trying to mitigate the sharing of information in the first place. But
Exactly. And yet, but people have work to do, and, then they get frustrated because they're saying, wait a second, I need to get my job done. So, trying to find the tools that enable people to share the data in a safer way, or only share the data they need, and in a way that makes it easy without creating so many barriers. That's where it can be tricky to find the right tools and solutions out there that make both sharing when you need it easy, without at the same time kind of dummy proofing
mhm.
the and avoiding the mistakes, preventing people from making the oopsies, um, but still giving them the ability to get their job done.
Mhm. It's interesting that you've also found that companies sometimes think that just removing the name, just removing a few digits of the credit card number are enough for anonymization. You've got the GDPR, the CPRA coming up as well, and a bunch of other regulations that list direct identifiers, quasi identifiers, and everything that you should consider as a minimum for
Yes.
anonymizing a data set. Do you think they're not reading these regulations, or is it a misinterpretation?
Yeah, I think it's probably because um, they're assuming and not reading closely is probably one of them. And these still, in sort of the grand scheme of things, um, GDPR is now 2 years old. Um, and if you didn't do business in Europe in the past, CCPA is now a year old, I guess, in terms of enforcement. And so it's kind of a new concept for a lot of companies that aren't steeped in privacy. So for privacy, people were like, oh, yeah, duh, of course, like I know this. But if, let's say that you are a smaller company and you don't have a privacy expert in-house, um, and the last time you really looked at privacy issues, or your lawyer looked at privacy issues, was years ago, and they went to some seminar, but it's not really their area of expertise, and so they don't know it in depth, and so they may be applying old concepts that they were used to from back in the day, when the only privacy laws out there were data breach laws, where personal data is often defined very narrowly to things like names plus credit cards, or names plus account IDs, or social security numbers. And so there's just there's a misconception about what it is, because we're applying old models to that. So those of us who are in the data world or are steeped in privacy, it feels like old news. But I still run into people who just, they aren't operating in this space a lot, who say, what's the big deal? It's just an email address, or it's just a phone number, or it's just a name. Like, and because we operate in our everyday lives, not necessarily ourselves thinking of that as being sensitive, um, sometimes people struggle to understand, like, why is it a big deal? Why is that considered personal data? So I think that's where it comes from. It's just kind of like a cultural thing. I mean, think about how much privacy has changed in just a couple of years since GDPR. It's been an explosion. And, there's a lot of people who are operating just in different spaces, and so they haven't really caught up. Then they can get caught off guard because they've applied old notions to a new world.
Hopefully it's just a matter of time.
I think so.
What do you think the best companies do to incorporate privacy into how they're handling the data?
So I'm going to be like totally biased here. I'm pretty proud of what Twilio has done, given the size of the company and where it has been in its growth trajectory in terms of incorporating privacy into how we handle data. I think that, and when I've talked to my colleagues at other companies that I admire and what they do, I think that they're really, it sounds so cliche, tone from the top culture, but it's kind of true. How do you build data stewardship and good data stewardship into who you are as a company and your brand identity and your identity as a good corporate citizen? The companies that do it the best are the ones that is part of who they are. Put aside what the law says, that's part of who their ethos is. You can even look at, like, Apple has a good reputation. They're not always perfect. They make mistakes, certainly, but they have a pretty good reputation in the privacy space, in part because of the way that they've really tried to, like, infuse it into who they are as a company, or at least that's what it appears to be as a outside observer. And I think that you see the same thing. Microsoft had some troubles back in the day, but they've really turned it around, and now they also have it infused into their cultural values. So when you have leadership that buys into the importance of privacy, then that sort of thing trickles down through the entire organization. That's who we are. We care about these things, because I think as privacy practitioners know, personal data is everywhere. It's all over the place. You can never have, if you expected a privacy team to do all the privacy for you and take care of it for you, you'd have to have hundreds of people. Like, it would be impossible. It doesn't scale. So you really need everybody in the organization who touches personal data to have a sense of ownership over being a good data steward, and not to sort of assume that somebody else will take care of it. Doesn't mean that you don't want to put in place controls and measures and ways to make that easier for people to be good data stewards, and so that you can you don't have to rely on everybody being an expert. But if you have people who have that mindset that privacy is important, then at least they know, like, I should ask the question. I should go find out if what I'm doing, is the right thing to do, if they have a question. Or they just will tend towards thinking about, oh, we need to be thoughtful about how we handle this data because it's personal data. And so we're going to just automatically do the right thing. Because I think a lot of times it's not maliciousness or intentionally bad behavior where you see companies falling down. It's just that the teams who essentially are the ones who have to handle the data, they aren't incentivized, and they don't feel that they have ownership over making sure that they do privacy right in their everyday life. So they don't think about it. Again, they don't mean to do something wrong. They see it either as a burden, it gets in their way, or they are it's not even something that occurs to them that they have to consider, and therefore they don't consider it, and therefore they run into trouble. So I would say that the best companies are the ones that truly do incorporate privacy into how they operate. It's not an outside thing coming in. It's not a check the box activity that I've got to, at the end of the whole thing, I guess I've got to go through the privacy check the box, but that it is something that is being thought about from the get-go, and it's on people's minds. Then you're going to get better data handling. And also, in the world of privacy, technology changes so much. If you just sort of followed the laws all the time perfectly, like, you may not actually get it right. And you look at some of the big things like Cambridge Analytica and other things that came out, and oh my goodness, these different companies were doing all these bad things with my data. But if you actually go back in time, some of the things that we now look at as being so awful weren't against the law. But now we look back and we think, well, that's not right. And so the law has to get to change and catch up. But if you have people who are thinking about doing the right thing by people's personal data and trying to take the right action, then it helps avoid bumping up against these issues that may be technically legal, but still from a standpoint of public policy shouldn't be, or don't seem like the right thing to do. So you kind of get into that data ethics side of things.
Mm-hmm. Love that. So embedding privacy and doing the right thing from the top down into the organization is the key.
I would definitely say so. It's, as much as it sounds cliche, I think it's super important.
Great. We are about to reach time. If you have 5 more minutes, we could take questions from the audience. I still have a bunch more questions to ask you, but we could take that offline at some point. So Kavinta asks, what are some first principles to consider to prepare to handle health data via your systems?
So, well, the first thing in terms of handling health data is there are some very specific regulations. Get to know HIPAA if you're a U.S. company. Get to know it well, because as much as I was like, oh, check the box activities, you do need to check the boxes, right? Like, the boxes still need to get checked, and the HIPAA compliance is going to be key. So really understanding where that health data is going, and making sure that you're at least checking the boxes baseline for checking the HIPAA privacy and security rules. And those are available online. You can just look them up, and the Health and Human Services has links on their website, and also guidance documentation to help companies implement. So there's a lot of materials, thankfully, around health data. And if you're doing data privacy right and data security right, a lot of the things are probably in place. But even before you get to that, you better know where the health data is going. So data mapping, really understanding, like, where's the health data moving towards, not just where is it sitting, but where is it traversing, so that you have a full view of what systems are actually in play. And then that'll make it so that you can actually know where to apply the HIPAA privacy and security rules. But certainly for the US, you got to look at HIPAA, and in a lot of other countries as well. If you're going globally, take a peek. There may well be, and a lot of this stuff, again, is just by Google searching it, you can find out if there is. A lot of countries have very specific health data related laws, so it's definitely a first stop to just check if you see anything. And then certainly if you do, you can always get some advice or see if you can find some of that guidance online.
Thank you. Kavinta asks what recommendations you have for keeping on top of the privacy regulations, any incoming ones that there might be.
Oh, that one is that is a tricky one to keep tabs on. I would say, honestly, the IAPP, that's the International Association of Privacy Professionals. They have a website and they have newsletters, and I keep tabs on that. It's a great centralized resource that you can just go and like sign up for their newsletters or join and get even more in-depth analysis access, that's a good way to just keep tabs on it. It is changing so rapidly that it is quite difficult to keep tabs on everything that's changing, but that's probably a good first stop as a as a starting point. And it's not trying to be a plug for IAPP. I just honestly, I think that's probably a good first stop. There's also a lot of good law firms out there that do newsletters. So DLA Piper, Field Fishers, Wilgen, or some big Baker McKenzie, or some of these big law firms that also you can just go onto their websites, and they have newsletters where they publish information about privacy laws. So that's another way. But I would say IAPP probably has the most comprehensive, global, and centralized place to find some of that information. And a lot of it you can still get without having to join.
Awesome. Great advice. Thank you so much, Sheila. It's been a pleasure speaking with you as always.
Yes.
Really excited that you could join us. It's been great.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us.